on a night when the city felt emptied of warmth and sound. Elliot Hale crossed the nearly abandoned parking lot behind his apartment building. The flickering yellow streetlights trembling over rain-slick concrete that reflected the glow like broken glass. And though he told himself exhaustion explained the tightness in his chest, he could not shake the sensation that something unseen lingered between the parked cars, watching with a patience that felt intimate rather than hostile. Elliot had spent much of his life learning how to make himself smaller, how to love quietly, how to exist without drawing attentions, so the presence did not frighten him at first, so much as it unsettled him with recognition. And when a shadow detached itself from the darkness, stretching into a tall, human shape with blurred edges and softly glowing eyes, dressed in clothing from another era, he realized this was not a monster, but a ghost bound by longing, one who introduced himself as Samuel, a man who had lived and died in a time when loving another man meant surviving in fragments and shadows. Night after night, Elliot returned to the lot, drawn not by danger but by the strange safety of being seen without judgment, and their conversations unfolded beneath mist and humming lights, revealing Samuel's unfinished life-secret meetings, stolen moments, love hidden so deeply it never had the chance to grow old. And in those exchanges Elliot confronted his own fears of visibility, intimacy, and loss, discovering that the ghost did not crave his body, but his courage. The courage to live openly in a world that still asked people like them to soften themselves. As their bond deepened, the space itself began to change, shadows thickening beneath the cars as if other forgotten lives were stirring. Echoes of suppressed love and grief gathering into something restless and dangerous, until one night the darkness rose, twisting into distorted forms that sought to keep Elliot trapped in the same stillness that had claimed Samuel. And in that moment of terror, Elliot understood that love was not meant to bind the living to the dead, nor the dead to their suffering, and with shaking resolve he stepped forward, offering Samuel not his fear, but his belief that love does not disappear when it is acknowledged. That being seen even briefly can be enough. The shadows recoiled and dissolved, the parking lot seeming to exhale as Samuel's form glowed with a peace that replaced decades of longing. And as dawn approached, he faded gently, not erased, but released, leaving Elliot alone beneath steady streetlights and drying pavement, changed by what had passed between them. In the weeks that followed, Elliot carried that encounter into his life, speaking more honestly, loving without apology, no longer shrinking himself to fit the darkness. And though the parking lot returned to its ordinary silence, he never feared empty spaces again, because he understood that some shadows are not there to haunt us, but to remind us that love, especially love once forced into hiding, can still guide us toward the light, even after it lets us go. As the nights passed, Elliot found himself returning to the parking lot with a quiet inevitability, as if some invisible thread tugged at him after midnight, drawing him back beneath the flickering streetlights where Samuel waited between the cars, his ghostly form resolving more clearly with each encounter. Though never fully solid, never quite belonging to the world of breath and warmth, their conversations deepened, unfolding slowly like a secret neither of them rushed to expose. And Samuel spoke of a life lived cautiously, of love exchanged in glances and coded words, of nights spent hiding in plain sight, while Elliot listened with a tenderness that surprised him, recognizing the familiar ache of restraint and the exhaustion of always measuring one's own visibility. There was intimacy in the way Samuel stood close, without touching, in the way his presence chilled the air just enough to make Elliot aware of his own skin, his own pulse, and sometimes Elliot felt an almost unbearable urge to bridge the distance between them. Not out of desire alone, but out of grief for everything Samuel had been denied. Yet the ghost always stepped back slightly, eyes glowing with something that resembled both longing and restraint. As their bond grew, the parking lot itself seemed to change, shadows lengthening unnaturally beneath the cars, pooling thicker each night as if drawn to the conversations, the confessions, the fragile connection forming between life and death. And Samuel grew quieter, more watchful, warning Elliot that the space remembered too much, that it collected what people left behind when they were forced to hide fear, shame, unfinished love, and that staying too long risked waking what should remain dormant. Elliot dismissed the warning at first, mistaking it for another metaphor, until one night the shadows began to move independently of the light, stretching and folding over one another like living things, whispering in fragmented voices that echoed regrets and unspoken truths. And Elliot realized with a surge of dread that the lot was no longer holding only Samuel, but countless remnants of lives paused and abandoned. Fear returned sharper this time, but it was tangled with something else: responsibility. And as the darkness pressed closer, Samuel's form flickered, weakened by the weight of what stirred around them, confessing that he had stayed because leaving meant accepting that his love had ended unseen, unlived in the open, and Elliot felt the truth of it pierce him, because he had spent years fearing the same thing. Standing there amid creeping shadows and trembling light, Elliot understood that what bound Samuel to the lot was not death, but the belief that love unacknowledged was love wasted. And in that realization, Elliot sensed that whatever waited between the cars was no longer just watching. It was waiting to claim them both. The night everything unraveled arrived without warning. The parking lot shrouded in heavier mist than Elliot had ever seen, the yellow streetlights flickering erratically as if struggling against something unseen. And from the moment he stepped onto the wet concrete, he felt the space recoil, shadows swelling beneath the cars with a density that seemed to swallow sound itself. While Samuel stood farther back than usual, his form wavering, edges blurring as though the darkness was pulling at him from all sides. The whispers began almost immediately. Not voices, but impressions, shame, fear. Longing ghosts of lives lived cautiously and ended quietly. And as the shadows stretched upward, they twisted into distorted, half-formed shapes that crowded closer, feeding on the connection between Elliot and Samuel. Drawn to the rare warmth of something finally being seen, Elliot's fear surged, but beneath it rose a fierce clarity as he realized the shadows were not evil in the simple sense, but starving, sustained by the absence of acknowledgement. And Samuel confessed in a fractured voice that he had remained here because leaving meant accepting that his love, his truth, had never been witnessed, that he had vanished without ever being fully known. As the darkness surged, pressing in with suffocating weight, Elliot stepped forward despite the cold biting into his skin, refusing to retreat. And in that moment he understood that what the shadows wanted was not his life but his silence. The same silence that had kept Samuel bound for decades. The lot seemed to tilt as the shadows reached for Elliot, curling around his legs like grasping hands. But he spoke aloud, his voice shaking yet steady, naming Samuel's love, his existence, his right to have lived openly, and with each word the shadows recoiled, shrinking as though burned by recognition, while Samuel's form brightened, his eyes glowing not with sorrow now, but with relief. And as Elliot reached out, not to touch, but to connect, a surge of emotion passed between them: grief, gratitude, love unfulfilled yet unbroken, and the darkness shattered, dissolving into mist that scattered across the pavement, leaving the parking lot eerily still beneath trembling lights. Samuel, standing at the center of it all, no longer flickering, no longer trapped, finally solid in his peace. As the last remnants of shadow dissolved into the cooling air, the parking lot seemed to breathe for the first time in decades, the mist thinning as the streetlight steadied into a warm, unwavering glow. And Samuel stood before Elliot, no longer pulled apart by grief or darkness, his form luminous yet gentle, eyes filled, not with longing, but gratitude, as he admitted in a soft, unburdened voice that being seen, truly seen, had been enough to loosen the chains that held him there. Elliot felt tears blur his vision, not from fear, but from release, as he understood that love did not need permanence to be real, nor touch to be intimate. And as dawn crept across the concrete, painting the wet pavement in pale gold, Samuel began to fade slowly, peacefully, not vanishing, but moving forward, leaving behind a quiet warmth that settled into Elliot's chest like a promise rather than a wound. When morning fully arrived, the parking lot looked ordinary against cars, concrete, and drying puddles, but Elliot was no longer the man who had once crossed it, shrinking into himself. And in the days that followed, he carried Samuel's legacy into his life, speaking more honestly, loving without apology, allowing himself to take up space in a world that once felt too narrow. Sometimes late at night, he passed the parking lot and felt only calm. No shadows stirring, no presence lingering. Because what had remained there had finally been allowed to rest. And though Elliot never forgot the ghost who had met him between the cars, he no longer felt haunted, knowing that some shadows are not meant to follow us forever.